Hello everyone. It's really great to be here among so many familiar and new faces. And thank you, the King's Foundation School of Traditional Arts, for inviting me to speak this evening. I thought it fitting to begin with an image of me painting a window in memory of a doctor, which included a portrait of the great medieval polymath and mystic Hildegard von Bingen. As the school's teaching, for those who know about her, because as the school's teaching opened my eyes to so many things. So thank you so much, Emma, for that introduction, because this really was quite a pivotal 2 years of my life. I have equally much reason to be grateful to King Charles, both in his patronage of the King's Foundation and his support in my own career. King Charles has been a great advocate for the traditional arts and heritage, and to receive an MBE from him, His Royal Highness, earlier this year was incredibly special. In 1996, I won a scholarship to train at the Prince of Wales Institute of Architecture on their 2 years master's programme in visual Islamic and traditional arts. The first year was, and it's very similar today, I believe, but the first year was spent studying and practicing traditional craft skills from all over the world, with my specialism of stained glass forming the focus of my second year. Here you can see some examples of my miniature painting and icon painting. Of course, I was also studying medieval stained glass, but visually it seemed to be very fragmented because of its turbulent history of repair and restoration. And I found it hard to often see the narrative or meaning. However, I loved illuminated manuscripts and translating them into glass, as these were telling the stories and still appeared as the artist intended. Two of my degree pieces, which we see in the slide, were translations of illuminated page from the Winchester Psalter, A Tree of Jesse, and this 13th century manuscript, God the Creator, with his dividers over the world, an image that I still find very inspirational. The founder of the course, Professor Keith Critchlow, was an architect, painter, and leading expert in sacred geometry and sacred architecture. He sought geometry everywhere, from a simple flower to the construction of some of the finest paintings in history. In terms of my interest in stained glass, he introduced me to the wonders of Chartres Cathedral, where he showed how medieval stained glass made sense in the context of a historic building. Keith did have a major influence on my thinking and development, and the 2 years I spent at VITA were extremely important to me. Ultimately, I understood the true meaning of education from educare, which is to bring and lead out. Keith and his school laid the foundations on which I would explore my own creative ideas rooted in tradition. At the heart of human appreciation for glass as a material is the beauty that comes with the interplay of its two qualities, that of colour and light. These everyday qualities interact in endlessly shifting ways. And this is one reason why stained glass, used for so much of human history, continues to be appreciated and loved today. I'd like to begin this lecture by sharing some of the history of stained glass from ancient times to the present day, with each period contributing an element of the craft we still practice today. I'll talk about the meanings associated with stained glass and its design developments over the centuries. And I'll build on its history, art and craft in my own practice, in creating stained glass windows, which I will illuminate through some key examples of my work. So to begin, what is glass? Glass is created essentially by mixing sand, which is silica, a bonding agent, an alkali flux of either potash, which is burnt beechwood, bracken or seaweed, and soda, which is salt. These ingredients are then heated to a high temperature with a stabilizer, usually calcium in the form of lime. Glass has been made for thousands of years, but there are many myths about its origins, such as the Venetian shipwreck described by the Roman historian Pliny the Elder. According to archaeologists, though, true stained glass originated in Mesopotamia around 4,000 years ago, where beads and glazed decorations on buildings have been found. It was, however, the invention of the blowing iron, probably in Syria in the 1st century BCE, when glass production really began to take off. The ability to blow molten glass into a hollow bulb, which led to the production of bottles, dishes, jugs, and so on. By the 1st century CE, the Romans were employing blowing techniques not only to produce these sort of vessels, but also for casting glass slabs. And the first evidence we have of sheet glass that would become the windows we now take for granted today. This slide, the image to the right, shows an early Roman pane found in England using the cast glass process. The molten glass was poured into trays, lined with sand and left to cool. But it was very impure, and the impurities such as iron gave it a bluish-greenish tint. The glass did let the light in, but it was very thick and not very transparent, and used in the colder northern cities of the Roman Empire. To colour glass, the glassmakers added powdered metallic oxides to the basic sand and ash mixture during the melting process. This resulted in tinted and coloured glasses known as pot metals, where the glass is coloured all the way through. Glassmakers knew and jealously guarded the glass recipes and furnace conditions needed to make the myriad of colours. Cobalt gives deep blue, copper can produce red or sky blue, manganese creates pinks and purples, and iron creates various greens. And these colours were used to great effect by the ancient glaziers. And the first extensive documentation of coloured glass production is credited to the 8th century Persian alchemist and glassmaker Jabir, the first true chemist. His book, The Book of the Hidden Pearl, written in the late 8th or 9th century, contains everything he knew about the production of coloured glass. And a little earlier, in Byzantine churches such as the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, we see that glass mosaics were used as a decorative and instrumental art form, depicting biblical scenes and other motifs. Window glass then served as a purely practical function, that's of illuminating the church. In the Islamic world, the use of glass branched out into many forms, and glassmakers in Syria and Egypt inherited Roman and Byzantine glass techniques and improved on them, perfecting their glass decoration and colouring and expanding their variety of glass vessels. In the 9th century, it was in the 9th century that a key discovery was made in the Islamic world, that glass vessels could be painted with metallic stains, resulting in what we call lusterware because of its sheen. In fact, it's due to the Islamic world that the Roman techniques were preserved to be later reintroduced in Europe through the Muslim conquests and the later Crusades. So coming back to sheet glass, from the cast glass slabs of the 1st century that we saw, in the Middle Ages, glassmakers used 2 types of methods to produce sheet glass. When following the so-called broadsheet or muff method, they took a bubble of malleable glass onto a blowpipe and then worked it into a cylinder. This cylinder was then cut open along its length, reheated and pressed flat into a sheet. An alternative way of making sheet glass was the crown method or spun method. The glassmaker transferred a bubble or crown of glass from the blowpipe to a metal rod called a pontil. And the bubble was opened and spun around the pontil with this centrifugal force caused the hollow bubble to flatten into a round disc, the crown, which was thicker at the centre rather than the edges. From the 8th century, in Islamic areas, coloured sheet glass was set into wooden or stucco frames in floral or geometric patterns. In the 1930s in Syria, archaeologists discovered an 8th century Islamic city in the desert near Palma. They found over 100 pieces of coloured glass and evidence that they had been mounted in framework of stucco in arabesque designs. The technique has also been found in Yemen, where instead of glass, thin pieces of alabaster let in the golden light through the design into the room between the stucco. Closer to home, this coloured glass was unearthed from St Paul's Monastery in Jarrow, founded in 685. Glass windows were a complete novelty in Britain at this time. And we also find windows of the same colours in archaeological digs in Byzantine Constantinople, modern Istanbul, which illustrates the flow of trade at the time across the full extent of Europe. Trade certainly did flow from France to Jarrow, as the 7th century abbot of Wearmouth, Benedict Biscop, travelled widely, visiting Rome many times. He wanted to build his new priory at Jarrow in the Romanesque style and brought glaziers, builders and masons over from France, as there were none in England at the time. Saint Benedict, as he is later became known, filled his monasteries with books that enriched the art and culture of England. And he also advocated the use of ornaments of stained glass windows, as he saw how they could help spread the Christian message. The popularity of stained glass stemmed from the widely held belief in the mystical relationship between glass, colour, light and God. The spirituality of light theme was developed by Pseudo Dionysius, an obscure monk from the late 5th, early 6th century, who developed the concept of light being the bedrock of matter. All was made of light, and the light was the material reflection of the heavenly light, the wisdom of God. In Genesis, we are told that God's first act after creation of heaven and earth was to divide the light from the darkness. His words are, "Let there be light." In John, he writes, "He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." And in the Quran, it reads, "God is the light of the heavens and earth. God has full knowledge of everything, shining out in houses of worship." In Islam, as in Judaism, God is never depicted pictorially, but in all the Abrahamic religions, God can be understood through the reference of light. Once again, Islamic influence can be seen in Christian stained glass in the use of colour and geometric design. As European stained glass artistry reached its height, its human figures are combined with complex geometric patterns. Writers do vary in particular symbolism associated with different colours. In Islam, the colour green is associated with nature, paradise and the Prophet Muhammad. And gold signifies divine light and the presence of God. In Christianity, the symbolism of colours and images becomes highly important, with blue symbolising the Virgin Mary, embodying purity and heaven. Red represents the blood of Christ and his sacrifice and martyrdom. And purple represents royalty, majesty and priesthood, Christ enthroned. Stained glass artists have also used contrast to emphasise their imagery. Red advances, blue recedes, and an optical effect we know as chromostereopsis, and white or clear glass was important for tempering the background effect of blue. So noting the relationship between glass, colour, light and God, stained glass soon became a vibrant medium to express the teachings of the Catholic faith. It transformed glassmakers into storytellers as they depicted images from the Bible to inspire the illiterate masses. It's also interesting to note that the first period of stained glass in the West is called by the art historians as the Byzantine period, because Byzantine icons and mosaics were used as models for the Western glaziers. The transmission of artistic techniques and ideas from Byzantium to the West contributed to the development of stained glass as a distinct art form. Much of what we know about the medieval stained glass making comes from the 12th century treatise on the various arts, written by the German monk known as Theophilus. He describes the basic steps needed to make sheets of coloured glass and to use these to create stained glass images. Apart from minor innovations, the techniques of stained glass making have been barely changed since Theophilus's time. Once the design has been chosen, the glazier or glassmaker selects and cuts the glass. They form their approximate shapes by drawing a hot poker over the glass surface, which created a heat fracture. These rough shapes were then nibbled to the accurate size with a notched steel called a grozing iron. The main features are then painted on the surface of the coloured glass with brown or black opaque paint made from a metal oxide, such lead and a frit of powdered glass. This was and still is mixed with various, the main features are then, this was and still is mixed with various carriers such as water, urine, vinegar and oil, creating trace lines as they follow the drawings beneath. And all this is then fired in a furnace to 650 degrees centigrade. In the 12th century, Abbot Sugar's understanding of the writing of Dionysius led him to the fascination with the symbolism of light. The natural light received by the stained glass windows, in Sugar's understanding, was transformed into new light, lux nova in Latin. This was symbolic of Jesus Christ, who is the light of the world, after it had been transmitted and refracted through the coloured glass. Sugar is known as the inventor of the Gothic architecture, as he sought to bring as much light as possible into his new abbey church of Saint-Denis. His walls of shimmering glass were held up by the smallest possible amount of structure, which led to the popular use of flying buttresses. These were quite different from the thick, heavy walls of the Romanesque. However, the increase in window size demanded a new approach to figurative work, with a shift from large single figures of Romanesque architecture to more complex, smaller scenes telling a more detailed narrative. Here, Abbot Sugar is depicted as a donor figure in the top left, in Denise offering a tree of Jesse, and to the right is a tree of Jesse window from Chartres Cathedral. Jesse trees are thematic in design as they explore a single theme, and in this case, it was the genealogical history of Christ's ancestry. As well as thematic imagery, we have narrative paintings telling the story in a visual sequence of events. This example depicts the life of Christ. This detail of the window shows the Annunciation to the shepherds. You can see that the opening is divided into a series of compartments, some circular, some square, with individual compartments separated by rich bands of foliage. And these are enclosed in borders of white glass so that each episode can be clearly seen. Other windows were more complex theologically, seeking to show links between the Old and New Testament. These so-called typological windows draw on the interpretation of Scripture, with the Old Testament events being seen to foreshadow later incidents in the life of Christ. Here you can see the descent from the cross in the centre, foreshadowed by Abraham commanding to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. And to the left, Abraham leads Isaac to the place of sacrifice, while on the right, an angel appears to stay his hand. So if it's coloured glass that's painted with the metal oxide, why do we call it stained glass? We actually tend to call everything stained glass, even when it's coloured glass that's painted. It's just easier. But once again, contact with the Islamic East was responsible for the most important technical innovation in stained glass of the Middle Ages. As you can see, yellow stain was certainly known to the Egyptians by the 10th and 11th centuries, and was probably discovered much earlier. However, it wasn't until the 13th century that a recipe for yellow stain learnt from the Egyptians was translated into Castilian and eventually reached the court of France. The yellow stain, which is a solution of silver nitrate, is applied with a brush like glass paint and burnt into the surface when fired. The discovery was important because craftsmen could now have two differing colours on one piece of glass without the separation of lead. And by the mid-15th century, most glass craftsmen were using silver stain throughout their windows. And because silver stain produced yellow, the 15th century became the golden age of stained glass. And we can see it here with the example, the Sacrament of Baptism window in Tattershall Church, Lincolnshire. By 1500, traditional stained glass in England appeared to be old-fashioned compared to the work produced on the continent. And towards the end of the 15th century, we see a new style emerging from abroad, from the Flemish school of glaziers. This was the start of the transition from the medieval period into the classic Renaissance. In England, Flemish artists set up their studios in Southwark, just beyond the jurisdiction of the London Guild of Glaziers. Their style was totally different as they were translating panel painting into the medium of glass. And this style grew even more popular in England when the Flemish glaziers were appointed by King Henry VII, and their style flourished into the mid-16th century. The slide seen here from St Mary's Church, Fairford, Gloucestershire, demonstrates these developments in style and technique. As you can see from the window to your right, there is less lead, more realistic painting style with shading and perspective. And the design also stretches across the mullions being the stone divisions within the window. And here with this window you see is the West Doom window, with Christ in majesty in the top tier and the Day of Judgment with St Michael weighing the souls in the lower tier. The souls either go up to heaven or down to hell, meeting this rather splendid figure of Lucifer that you see here, swallowing the lost souls in his fish head style. And this window was a particular favourite to mine when I was starting out, and it kind of instilled a lot of Keith Critchlow's thoughts, because the geometry from the heart of Christ is these radiating circles that kind of stretch outwards as well, which was quite a powerful image. The Flemish glaziers also brought and developed impressive glazing techniques, abrading flashed glass, which is predominantly clear glass with a thin layer of colour. And they also added yellow stain, therefore giving three colours, red, white and clear, in one piece of glass, as we can see here on the scabbard. And the use of jewelling too, which we see top right, inserting leaded glass into a drilled hole. And for me, the work of the Flemish glaziers represents the high point of the art and craft in stained glass in England. However, almost immediately after, from the 1930s onwards, religious change and political unrest of the Reformation contributed to the massive disruption of the glass painter's world. The Catholic Church had been the principal patron of the arts and decoration, but the new Protestants were largely hostile to it. The iconoclasm of the dissolution of the monasteries and later Puritanism of Oliver Cromwell resulted in significant destruction of stained glass. Not only did the English appetite for stained glass shrink over the succeeding centuries, but the experience, knowledge and craft of the glaziers who created these medieval masterpieces was virtually lost too. In England, this cultural change resulted in more emphasis on secular domestic spaces. A reduction in the imported coloured glass resulted in the use of just pigment on white glass, as we see here in the coat of arms from Stamford-on-Avon. But this situation led to another technical development, coloured enamels, used from the 16th century onwards. They found that by using ground-coloured glass was used to paint on the surface of the glass, which would then be fired. And this technique allowed the artist to paint several colours onto one small pane, eliminating the need to separate them with lead. This later example from Redbourne Church shows the incredible skill in the use of silver stain, creating a multitude of shades from yellow to deep red. All of the colours here are created from stains and enamel on clear glass. And this is a deliberate imitation from canvas painting, as the glass is based on an original oil painting by Francis Danby. It depicts the opening of the sixth seal in the Revelation, the end of the world. And as you can see, the lead is being used merely to hold the canvas of clear rectangular panes together. But such panel painting destroys the translucent essence of the medieval art, and the skill and technology of making coloured glass is irrelevant. So we've been through the rise of the Gothic, the impacts of the classical Renaissance, and the destruction of the Reformation. But with the 19th century, all this changed again with the Gothic revival. The 19th century architect Augustus Pugin, inspired by a passion for the medieval art and symbolism, led this return to the true principles of Gothic architecture. The renewed interest in windows for his Gothic churches, plus the reductions in glass costs, led to an explosion of Victorian studios in England, fabricating his window designs. In the early stages, glass was however, of poor quality. And you can see from the zingy colours, the zingy green in particular, that these were quite unlike the medieval glass palette. However, as demand increased, mass production of stained glass windows was seen on an almost industrial scale. Pugin revived stained glass manufacture. However, it was William Morris, along with John Ruskin, who rejected industrial manufacture in favour of artist, designer, craftsman. Their arts and craft movement returning to valuing the materials of stained glass and the skills of the stained glass artist. Another leader in the arts and craft movement, Christopher Wall, produced a famous book, Stained Glass Work, with these 4 principles. And the one that I find is the favourite, which is the last one, is to be prepared sometimes to make sacrifices of profit for the sake of the art, should the interests of two clash. A few decades later, the Second World War resulted again in massive destruction across Europe. And a key example of post-war reconstruction England is the new Coventry Cathedral, built alongside the bombed-out ruin of the medieval building. And this was to be seen as a powerful symbol of peace and reconciliation. The competition for the new Coventry Cathedral was won with a dramatic modern design by British architect Basil Spence in the modernist brutalist style. The glass openings were filled by leading British painter John Piper in collaboration with stained glass artist Patrick Renshins. And their stained glass is truly breathtaking, and for me remains one of the great showpieces of post-war British glass. And it's also, most importantly, opened the doors to new approaches in contemporary glass. Today, the church continues to be a major patron of stained glass, but from the late 20th century onwards, stained glass has penetrated a far wider range of architecture, and architectural glass is now seen in airports, shopping centres and offices. So that is the history bit over, and we're now coming straight to the 21st century with me. So now to my inspirations and influences, which have guided my stained glass journey. From an early age, both art and craft played an important role in my upbringing. With my mum, I regularly visited galleries and museums and experienced a wide variety of art from all periods. My father was a craftsman, and he came from a long line of cabinet makers and blacksmiths, and he's the reason why I love making things. And my stepdad provided me with academic support and was the one who encouraged me to do work experience alongside my studies with notable glass firms such as Barley Studios. When I was younger, though, some pictures really stood out. And very early on, I was particularly drawn to art that had a strong narrative, such as the works of Italian artists like Giotto, who created dynamic compositions with figures drawn directly from life. For me, Giotto, Mogliani and Liechtenstein even all demonstrated a simplicity and directness of light and colour. I love them all, but now I realise that actually their art is quite similar to stained glass. With the work of Dutch artists such as Caravaggio, I was attracted to the physical immediacy, the feeling that you were witnessing an intimate moment intensified by the dramatic use of light and dark, how it takes the image kind of upwards with the diagonals. And this might also be said for Rodin, with the figures and composition full of character, awakened by the play of natural light over the surface and forms. I was very taken by the sculpture too. And finally, Politzer, known as the godfather of pop art. And here you see 2 fabulous artworks, one at the Whitworth Tapestry, which I saw regularly as a little girl, and the sculpture Newton and Blake holding the dividers reminiscent of the divine geometer. I started learning and exploring my vocation in glass at the University of Sunderland in 1993, with its history of glassmaking, where I had the opportunity to study glass blowing, kiln glass and ceramics, as well as drawing from life. However, I quickly chose my specialism of stained glass, as I loved the way it combined both art and craft, and have never looked back. As a student, one of the first projects I worked on at Barley Studios was the unique glazing scheme I've shown you earlier at St Mary's Church, Fairford in Gloucestershire. As you can see on the far right, as you can see on the left, St Jerome's face was lost, and as part of the restoration, I was asked to create it, looking at evidence of other faces in the scheme. And to the right at Green Hamilton, I worked on the restoration of the base panel of this Powell's window, again based on evidence of other windows in the chapel. In 1998, I joined the permanent staff of Barley Studios as artist and conservation glass painter. Keith Barley founded Barley Studios in 1973, having completed his apprenticeship at the new formed York Glaziers Trust. Keith is a renowned glass conservator and pioneered the use of environmental protective glazing to preserve fragile stained glass in the UK. And in 1996, Keith worked with stained glass artist Patrick Renshins and architect Martin Stancliffe on the new west window for Southwell Minster. Keith's task was to use his knowledge of historic stained glass, advising Patrick on suitable glass and paint colours for this 15th century building. And in 2015, Keith received his MBE from His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales in acknowledgement of his important services to cultural restoration and conservation. I'm pleased to say that Barley Studios recently celebrated 50 years in business, undertaking its conservation, restoration and creation of stained glass. And since I joined the studio in 1998, our multi-skilled team of 10 craftspeople have supported me in creating over 100 new stained glass commissions in buildings throughout the UK and internationally. I'm now going to talk about a few of my projects. And firstly, though, hopefully of interest to those practitioners in the audience. I'll describe how I approach a commission before recapping on the process of making a window in modern times. And I'll start by saying I actually love working to commission and the challenge of meeting a client's brief. And when I begin my designing process, I think of these 7 points from the start. And I hope to show you that although my process might be the same each time, through these 7 points, they result in very different designs because of the different contexts and constraints. For me, the process can be seen as a series of artworks from design, which is the small scale design here, the Vidamus, to the full-size cartoon, its cut line, the glass cutting, the painting and the leading to the finished window. And what's interesting is these stages have hardly changed since the 12th century. Every stage of design and production is important to me as I keep reflecting and modifying as I go, the craft in service of the art and the art informing the craft. I feel I'm orchestrating through the whole process, balancing the demands of the narrative, movement, light and colour, a constant reflection on what's in front of me, coming into being. And it really feels like sculpting, but my medium is light. And here's the finished window. St Brandan's at Brancepeth is a medieval building which was in 1998 suffered an arson attack and was reduced to a badly damaged stone shell. This is the point of the history of the building. The congregation decided to rebuild and their architect devised a light modern interior, and this was inspired by the architectural space surrounding the window. As you can see, it's very simple. In commissioning their new east window, the Fabric Committee wanted to provide a strong liturgical focus within this restored church, the purpose of the window. However, some wanted etch-clear glazing, giving a view of the outside landscape, while others preferred a traditional full-coloured window. These were the people who used the building. My aim was to reconcile these conflicting views with a bold, colourful design, which nevertheless includes large areas of clear, plain glazing. So we see in the window that the top half of the east window is filled with an explosion of colour that celebrates St Brandan's journey in search of the Garden of Eden, probably in the Canary Islands, hence a selection of tropical flowers. And here are 2 different approaches for the same subject, Thomas Becket. To the left, with the congregation of a church dedicated to St Thomas of Canterbury, the 12th century saint, wanted a window firmly connected with their patron, but without a human figure. The central motif is a sweeping band of elaborate geometric pattern taken from Beckett's embroidered amice, a piece of a liturgical vestment worn under the alb. The amice stands for Becket himself and the manner of his martyrdom, as it would have been worn around his shoulders and covered his neck. So in the lower part of the window can be seen 3 chuffs from Beckett's coats of arms, representing his earthly life, and they're quite disturbed as they're flying around. And then in the upper part, the stars of the heaven shine, so heaven and earth are united by this terrible act of martyrdom. And then to the right, the figurative window represented the martyrdom too, and you can see in the left-hand light, Thomas Becket leaning against the stone mullion. And in the right are the 4 knights entering the cathedral, with one of them with their sword raised as his shadow is cast menacingly across the floor. And behind the knights, I use stained glass that depicts the miracles attributed to Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. And now I thought I'd show you some early examples of my geometric, figurative and abstract work. Ely Cathedral's Millennium Project was to reinstate the link between the 14th century Lady Chapel and the east end of the cathedral, restoring the original walkway that was used by the medieval monks. The brief of the project was to produce a design that was sympathetic to the surrounding fabric and incorporating donor inscriptions, symbols of the Virgin Mary and those of Ely Cathedral. And you can see here that my windows are based on geometric principles, inspired by medieval grisaille glazing and their typical colours. And the idea was that geometric pattern kind of moved you from one building to another, encouraging us to kind of process rather than focus on the actual stained glass in front of you. One of my first figurative works was a church that was virtually destroyed by an IRA bomb, St. Ethelburger's, which was rebuilt to become an architectural space with a new purpose, a centre of reconciliation and peace to encourage faith communities to work together. The brief was to show St. Ethelburger, and I had to work with a 14th century ironwork support that you see to the left and the fragments of the 19th century Kemp stained glass. So to the new window, we have St. Ethelburger, who was the first leader of a monastic order for women in England. And she is shown dressed in a black robe as an abbess and a veil with the white wimple of the Benedictine order. I've got her, and what I decided to do was have her striding across the composition as if seen through the cloister openings, her upward gaze held by the radiant vision of the heavenly Jerusalem. A few years later, I was honoured to create 7 stained glass windows designed by Professor Keith Critchlow, incorporating symbols of reconciliation, the sun and the moon, within the gardens of St. Ethelburger's, with a geometric design, with each one carrying the word peace in different languages. A change of direction from my figurative and geometric work came when I won a major competition to create a 21st century pilgrimage in art for the retro choir of Beverley Minster, a medieval building of European significance. As an example of the influence of Keith Critchlow's teaching, responding to the whole space, I didn't just create a stained glass window, I created life-size sculptures in copper, a candle stand and oak seating, all interlinked by their underlining geometry and the common theme of pilgrimage. A major element was the new stained glass window in a large opening in the south wall, immediately next to the east window, which was a 19th century jumble of mostly medieval glass from other windows in the church. And this, I decided, was to be my first abstracted work, as I felt necessary to create as to harmonise and not compete with the figurative east window. I wanted to create an abstract window with its strong composition, colour scheme and sense of narrative, which did not conflict with the ancient glass, but was a friendly neighbour to it. And I also created 2 life-size sculptured pilgrims created in triangular forms that lead the viewer towards the window. So as you entered the retro choir, you either saw the figures whose glass hearts looked to the window, or you saw the window whose heart shone on the figures. But whichever way you were in, you were within kind of a movement or a pilgrimage. My largest figurative window to date is a Jessie window at St Mary's Priory Church in Abergavenny. And this huge oak figure is all that exists of a vast 15th century sculpture depicting the genealogy of Christ taken from the Gospel of Luke and Matthew. And I won this commission through a national competition to create a new window which would grow from the medieval figure and complete the family tree of stained glass. Thinking about the church dedication to the Virgin Mary, her symbol is the lily flower, which led me to the idea of the flower of life, the sixfold geometry underpinning the lily flower. And in my design, the sixfold pattern is expanded across the whole window to become a tree. Its branches make up the intersecting lines of the geometric pattern and representative of the family tree and depicting the genealogy of Christ. And within the flower of life, these are some of the figures and within their story. So we have Adam, who's shown expelled from the Garden of Eden with the apple and the serpent, while Abraham is raising his eyes to God with a knife ready for the sacrifice of his son Isaac. And also the Virgin Mary at the heart of the design, her commanding presence reminiscent of the Madonna of the Belvedere at Chartres. And here's the final window, dedicated by the Bishop of Monmouth in the presence of then Prince of Wales. My largest geometric window to date is also based on the Flower of Life geometry. The new Lily Chapel in Manila, which has been designed by architect Hiroshima Nakamura and commissioned by Phil Invest. I was asked to design stained glass for 6 windows on the theme of Our Lady of Lourdes that flow from the ground upwards. And each window opening is nearly 20 metres tall by 1.6 metres wide. The design combines colour, geometry, pattern and symbolism to create an atmosphere of contemplation within the chapel. And the design is constructed to use the section created by the structural supports, and the coloured glass is textured to disguise the diagonal lines. Although the majority of what I do would be recognisable to medieval stained glass makers, there are also relatively new techniques such as glass fusing. And a few years ago, I attended a glass fusing workshop in Maryland in USA with Narcissus Quagliata. This technique takes crushed glass called frit, which can then be can create lots of colours when it's melted and fired, hence the fusion. I decided, therefore, to incorporate the disciplines of fusion with those of traditional stained glass for a recent commission in Hovingham, North Yorkshire, a memorial to the Worsley family, which also used both using representational and abstract imagery. The owl and the woodpecker, as you can see, are made using traditional stained glass techniques where the oak leaves, ivy leaves and sunrise were created with glass fusing. And then all the components were leaded together. Although my work can mainly be found in churches and cathedrals, I've also created work for prestigious secular buildings such as the Royal Air Force Club in London. And what's interesting about this commission, in particular, I've done 2 windows there, but this commission was where the windows are located in the former anteroom to the ladies' bar and lounge. So it's the only part of the club where women were allowed until the 1960s. The 2 windows, which you can see have little light currently. The 2 windows show details of activities the 2 windows were to show details of activities were undertaken by women during the 2 world wars to the present day. From the operations room, clock and typewriter. Next slide, I'll just show you. The 2 windows show details of activities that were undertaken by women during the 2 world wars to the present day. From the operations room clock and typewriter to the left-hand window to the Merlin helicopter and the Hercules and Tornado aircraft on the right. And my inspiration, which I'll just slip back again to, was Rosie the Riveter on the left, who apparently kept the Air Force together. So the idea was that, sorry to mixture up, that you see that I've got all these symbols and then there's a row of rivets that go across the base of the window. And the idea that these images then have kind of iconic imagery, as you can see down here, of people who kind of did various important events during that, but they're holding the Air Force together. These windows were unveiled by Her Majesty the Queen, herself a member of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS, during the war. And at this special unveiling, the Queen told us that she still knows how to strip down and rebuild a car engine. These are some more examples of my secular work. A domestic window to the left called Falling Water, which is made from clear textured glasses. An exhibition piece called Time and Space, made for an exhibition at Hawpore Mansion in Hong Kong. And a door panel for an architect's office, blending the client's love of the work of Italian architect Carlo Scarpa with Scottish cartoon character Urs Woolley. And coming to the end of my talk, as we have seen, there is a long tradition of artists collaborating in stained glass. For example, Fairford's Doom window with Flemish painters and glaziers. This tradition continues to the present day with artists such as Matisse, Chagall, Brangwyn, and Piper and Renshins collaborating on the window for Coventry Cathedral. I too have been part of this process, collaborating with notable living artists such as Royal Academician, Hughie O'Donoghue and David Hockney. And both of these projects required me to translate pictures into the medium of lead glazing, and both were in the same building, Westminster Abbey in London. The Very Reverend Dr. John Hall, Dean of Westminster at the time, wanted to commission something for Westminster to create the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. He felt that David Hockney, RA, was one of the most influential British artists of the Queen's reign and was the obvious choice to design it. However, Hockney had never worked in stained glass, so Dr. Hall asked me to assist him to translate his design into glass. Hockney's design depicts a country scene featuring hawthorn blossom, which is described as a celebration reflecting the Queen as countrywoman and her love of the great countryside. Having used the iPad to create many artworks previously, David felt that the perfect medium to design for stained glass because both are viewed by transmitted light. And to assist with the design and development, I was invited to stay with David in California to ensure that that the leading divisions of his design would work with the support structure required for the window. The window is actually quite unique in the Abbey and slightly controversial, but it's unique in the Abbey because it uses no glass paint, only glass and lead to create the artwork, similar to Matisse's windows at the Chapelle de Vence in France. In fact, the only painted piece in the window, which you probably can't see on the slide, bottom right, I think it was, is his signature, which was actually signed in glass paint, and there was flown from York to Los Angeles to be fired in a kiln. From Los Angeles to York to be fired in a kiln. It was an amazing opportunity and experience for me to work alongside David and his team, and it's a memory which will stay with me forever. To conclude, I'm driven endlessly to create an effect. I want people to respond when they experience light, colour and content of my windows. Kenan Malik wrote in The Guardian about the difference between sacred and religious art, and his article really stuck with me. And the reason being because I don't think I'd actually thought about sacred art since I was here at college. And I did feel I'm kind of working towards that, and I'm trying to create a response in people where they are uplifted and it doesn't matter what their beliefs are. Religious buildings have long been designed as an experience, a physical space for contemplation and worship. And Christianity uses stained glass as part of this experience. Our work is literally monumental, and it's an integral part of the fabric of the building. Having said that, we often see, as I did as a child, stained glass as holy wallpaper. People just pass by, perhaps noticing it a bit here and there. I'm trying to change that and make people stop and look, really look. Our response to the building can result in something entirely new, not necessarily blending into the background, but creating an effect that extends the building. The effect of stained glass is why it will never go out of fashion. People respond to colour and light, whatever their beliefs, and images have the power to both attract attention and tell a story. And this is what I hope I am doing in my windows, creating a work of art that might uplift people spiritually and attract their attention and tell them a story. It's like letting light into the eyes, souls, and minds. This is certainly how I feel when I look back over the windows I've designed and made. Through the teaching, morals, and values of the Bible, this work has allowed me to explore a lot and think deeply about many aspects of life. Through the history that I have sketched above, I've learned so much about different cultures and ideas, and how people have used colour and light for spiritual reasons and effects. There's a wealth of inspiration from the meaning that stained glass has acquired over time, from alchemy and symbolism of light to the words in the Bible. The art and craft, therefore, of stained glass has enriched my life as a source of spiritual and intellectual growth. And it really mirrors the use of stained glass over the centuries I've been describing. My vocation is a triumph of light over darkness in many ways. What's quite amusing about this is I was chosen to represent the government for Craft is Great just before lockdown, and I was very excited to be a poster girl. But what sadly happened soon after is we had lockdown. So fantastic posters like this that adorn Manchester Airport and lots of places that I thought people might see it, never saw them. So here's the poster. Okay, I'm going to finish, as Emma said, about a book that we've just brought out, which is an overview of the contemporary creation of conservation of stained glass with illustrated examples. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.